Morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Frank Baker, District 3 City Council. I'm the chair of Boston City Council Committee on Jobs, Wages, and Workforce Development. I'm joined by my colleagues, Councilor Kim Janey from District 7, and also Councilor Lydia Edwards from District 1. I want to remind you that this is a public hearing being recorded and broadcast on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city council TV. Please silence all your cell phones and other devices. We will take public testimony at the end of this hearing. Would appreciate it if you would sign in and indicate if you would like to testify. Today's hearing is on docket number 1398 in order for a hearing regarding a biannual review of the Boston Employment Commission and the Boston Residents' Jobs Policy. I ask that when you do give your testimony, please state your name first clearly and your affiliation. At this point, I'd like to open up with opening statements from the councilors. Councilor Janey.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for convening this, Mr. Chair, and I certainly want to acknowledge and thank Councilor Edwards for her partnership. Also want to recognize that we are joined by former City Councilor Chuck Turner, who has been a strong advocate on this issue, making sure that we've got construction jobs that are going to Boston residents, to people of color, and to women. Is very important, particularly if we are talking about ensuring economic opportunity for people in our community and making sure that we are closing the wealth gap. There are a number of jobs, construction sites going on through our city because of this economic boom, and we've really got to do all we can to make sure that those jobs are going to our people. And so I'm glad that we have this panel before us. I'm certainly grateful for the work of the BEC and making sure that that is happening. I have the pleasure as being the district counselor for Roxbury, South End, Dorchester, and Fenway to monitor jobs. I've continued that tradition of monitoring the construction jobs in Roxbury to make sure that that is happening. And so working with members of the monitoring committee, many of whom are here this afternoon, looking forward to their testimony. What I know from doing this work over the last 10 months, almost a year, is that a lot more needs to be done to make sure that we're hitting the numbers, to make sure that we are actually building a pipeline, particularly for women in the industry, making sure that more is being done around Madison Park to strengthen that as a pipeline. So I won't take up a lot of time here. I've got a lot of questions, and I know that there's a video and panel presentations, but just wanted to, once again, thank the panel, thank all of the advocates in the room, and just kind of clearly state my commitment to making sure that we're doing all we can to, again, for Boston residents, people of color, and women in the construction industry, and that we're actually meeting the goals set forth by the city. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. I'd also like to recognize former State Senator Diane Wilkinson for your work also, and also former State Representative Carlos Enriquez. Thank you for joining us here today. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you. I just wanted to make my comments brief. Thank you for your work. Thank you for coming out here to continue this conversation. And as I understand, it'll be a continued conversation that we have regularly. So it's just wonderful to set the bar high and to make sure that we set a rhythm that we all can sustain for transparency and making sure that we continue to advocate and work for the same goals. This is one of the hearings we look forward to. It's not an adversarial one. For one, we all want the same thing. It's wonderful to see the work that you're putting in. And so I wanted to acknowledge other partners who are also in the room or would want to be in this room as well. As we've already recognized the former elected, I would also like to recognize some folks who are in the trade and working really hard in their own leadership. Canel Broomstein from Local 103, one of the leaders there, who is making sure that people of color, women have continued pathways in the trades, which is, again, important for our growth. I do know that the Boston Building Trades wanted to be here or may also be providing a statement in support. We've heard from the Teamsters, heard from several other locals as well. Also want to acknowledge some developers who are interested in this. Clayton Turnbull, Richard Taylor, who are very much excited about assuring that the workforce is diverse as they continue to grow in the city of Boston. So I'll leave it at that. I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And just for the record, I'd like to read something from Council President Andrea Campbell. Dear Chairman Baker and colleagues of the Committee on Jobs, Wages, and Workforce Development, due to a long-standing obligation, I regrettably cannot attend today's hearing regarding Docket 1398, a biannual review of the Boston Employment Commission and Boston Residents' Job Policy. I am grateful to the makers of this hearing order, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Janey, for emphasizing the importance of complying with the Boston Residency Jobs Policy, and look forward to working in partnership to ensure that the Council receives regular reviews and data collection. I will be ably represented by one of my staff members at today's hearing, and I look forward to reviewing the committee's report and any recommended next steps. Sincerely, Andrea J. Campbell, Boston City Council, District 4. And with that, I turn it over to the panel. John, I assume you're going to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Baker, Councilor Edwards, Councilor Janey, I want to first thank you for
Can you
your
state your
continued...
name, please? Just
Name is, yes, sir, John Barrows, Chief of Economic Development for the City of Boston.
thank you, John.
I want to first recognize the partnership that we have with the council on this, and we want to thank you for setting the bar high and looking forward to at least being in front of you twice a year to make a public presentation on something that we believe is truly important. It is a priority of Mayor Walsh and the administration to increase equity in the construction and real estate development industries and ensure good jobs for all Bostonians, which is why we have a full team here. I am extremely honored to have the work of the BRJP and BEC within the Economic Development Cabinet. And the leadership that you see here at the table carries out that work. And and you're going to be hearing from everybody at the table in our brief presentation, but wanted to acknowledge to my right, the chair of the Boston Employment Commission, Travis Watson. I want to recognize Chris Brown to my far left, who's the BRJP manager. I want to recognize Kim Oden, who is the BEC coordinator. And I also want to recognize Sharice Hearns, who is deputy director. And I think, you know, we've had ongoing conversations about the city's own capacity to monitor this work. We've had ongoing conversations about our ability to communicate, the numbers, data, et cetera. So what I wanted to bring to your attention, and I'll use this slide a little bit so people can follow along with some of this information. Those are the folks who are testifying today or presenting today. The Mayor's Office of Economic Development has spent some time through investments supported by the council in beefing up the capacity of our new equity and inclusion unit within the Economic Development Department. That new equity and inclusion unit now has a director, and the director is here with us. We announced last week that Selena Barrios Milner, who is here, if you could please stand, is the new director of the Equity and Inclusion Unit for the City of Boston. I also see with her our new outreach coordinator. I'm going to call out Josh McFadden. Josh, just raise your hand or stand. I see Richard, who is also new. I want to introduce some of the new people on the team working on procurement. Thank you, Rich. And I'm proud to be joined by the Equity and Inclusion staff. And in fact, if you're a member of the Equity and Inclusion team, if you could just please stand, just so you can be acknowledged here today. Thank you very much. It is critical that we have the right amount of staff to do this. So once again, we added 3 new construction monitors to the team. We also added a very strong BEC coordinator. So Kim is here. You'll hear from her a little later. And we added a new program monitor to the team. In addition to that, we heard from folks that internally and externally that we needed to upgrade the technology that was being used to both house the data and share the data. So happy to announce that we've received the funding to do such. And so the implementation and training of a new Salesforce platform is currently underway to ensure accurate tracking and timely reporting. And it's really important that our website is able to give timely information and that we're able to run a variety of reports so that we can be strategic in how we move this work forward. Another large piece to this puzzle, and would be happy to address, is the ongoing disparity study that we are currently undertaking. And the disparity study was launched this year and will be completed next year. And I am looking forward to the results of that study and to continue to work with you in making sure that the procurement process for the city is more equitable and more people get to participate. I also want to recognize, I just saw walking in, the work of our former Director of Economic Policy and Research, and that's Carolyn Crockett, who did amazing work. Yes, she did. And continues to be a partner with the city on the disparity study from across the river at MIT. I want to recognize some of the partners that are here. Some have already been recognized, but the work of the city is done best in partnership with our residents and our activists. And there are those who have been pushing and advocating in this area, continue to push and advocate in this area, and I want to recognize the importance of that. Former City Councilor Chuck Turner is here. Members of the Monitoring Committee from the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan Oversight process, members of the Boston, Priscilla, give me the Black Economic Justice Institute, thank you. Dorchester, Roxbury Labor, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to call out some of them a little later in my formal presentation. So what we see is, even though we have a robust economy with over $9.3 billion of active development under construction right now in the city of Boston, we still have huge disparities. In 2018, we added another, we currently have approved $6.8 billion of new development in the pipeline. We have 55.4 million square feet of new development worth $26.5 billion that have been approved since 2014. And, through September, we've already matched, in fact, the 2017 approvals. So we are in a record-setting year. We are in a record-setting 4 years. We're seeing unprecedented growth. Nearly 20% of housing approved is income restricted. 4,210 units of that 866 units, out of the 4,210 units that we've approved, 866 units are restricted. Jobs are at unemployment is at a historic low. Right now in Boston, unemployment is at 3%, Massachusetts at 3.2%. And in some of our neighborhoods that have had, double-digit growth, unemployment numbers, we are seeing in Roxbury 4.8% unemployment, Dorchester 6.4% unemployment, Mattapan 5.4% unemployment. Still multiples of the city's unemployment number, but we are doing better as a city in the unemployment numbers. Construction accounts for 2.4% of Boston's workforce. Between 2010 and 2016, construction jobs grew just under 5,000 positions. While those positions represent a strong economy and bustling development, we know that doesn't tell the whole story. Not everyone is working, and even though unemployment is down, when you start to cut those numbers, we have gross disparities in unemployment. Our workforce is stretched thin because of lack of preparation and lack of access. However, not everyone is part of the workforce labor pool. And so the data doesn't tell the whole story. We still have to push, and we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure more Bostonians are being employed. But that's the labor force numbers that we do have. We have a disparity study that is finishing up phase 1 and working towards phase 2. So the disparity study is going to look at the other side of this, which is the number of women-owned and minority-owned businesses in Boston that are involved or part of the growth as it relates to Boston's procurement. On the BRJP compliance information or the work that we're doing around employment, it is important that we look at the numbers that we have historically and then also understand the work that's being done because of the new ordinance. Think about what we've done in the past and learn from that and think about what we can do better in the future. So this first presentation, we'd like to delineate a little bit and talk about the overall BRJP numbers and then talk about the new BRJP numbers and think about the new tools that we have, how they're going to be implemented, et cetera. So you're going to hear from members of the BRJP team, and then you're also going to hear from the chair of the BEC in that regard. During 2018, August of 2018, these are the numbers we've seen for the BRJP compliance. In August 2018, we saw really low numbers coming into the BEC hearings of an average of 19% on residents, 14% on people of color, and 6% on women.
What was the second number, John?
14% on people of color. We quickly huddled and started calling meetings to bring people in to have conversations on why the numbers were so low. As of October, what we're seeing is 40% residents, 40% people of color, and the women numbers are still hovering around the same. This is 2018. In fact, I'm presenting this as if it's the whole hearing. This is right. This is 2018. Sorry, here I'm actually presenting it. Thank you, Sharice. Yes. This is a 2018. This is one project as an example. This is the Dudley Library project. This is not the summary of all of them.
Yeah. So the numbers you just gave us, excuse me, were just for the Dudley Library?
This is just for the Dudley Library as an example of, in fact, what we saw as an overall dip in numbers. These numbers belong to the library itself. And so what we saw was a dip in the summer, August and October. This represents that dip. There was a dip in the summer of numbers. And so we started calling meetings with the GCs, and we started calling meetings with the subs and business agents to have a conversation about what was going on. We've since seen the numbers increase. So for Dudley, for example, we've seen the numbers increase where the residents number are now at 40%, the people of color number at 40%. Women numbers actually ticked up a little bit but stayed stable. And so now the Dudley average is 26% residents, 46% people of color, and 5% women, heading in the right direction. So this work is not, the point being, this work is not going to be accomplished because we have an ordinance. This work is not going to be accomplished because we have a new way of doing business. This work is only going to continue to move forward because we're paying attention to it. We're sitting in front of people. We're calling people in and paying attention to what they're doing and talking about best practices in what they're doing so that they can continue to do it better. So that said, I want to pass it on to members of the team here so that we can talk about the new ordinance, the difference between the old ordinance and the new ordinance, the process that we use in monitoring so that you guys understand the work that we do and some of the challenges and some of the benefits in the work that we do. Talk about the BEC and the work that the BEC does in the hearing, and then open it up for question and answer.
I assume someone's going to deal with the overall numbers.
Yes.
Right,
So you will hear the
12 months,
overall
right?
numbers,
Okay, thank you. That's
from
all.
from
For all
members
your-
of the team.
Your projects, thank you.
Chris?
Excellent. Thank you, Chief Barrows. We appreciate the opportunity to appear in front of you today to talk about all the work that the BRJP office does to ensure that Boston residents, people of color, and females are working on city projects. So the first item that I'm going to talk about is the new ordinance. January 25th, 2017, a new BRJP ordinance was passed, and the overall workforce percentages are for Boston residents to be 51%. That's up from 50%. People of color, the numbers are now 40%. That's the goal. The previous ordinance, it was 25%. And for female, we have a workforce goal of 12%. That's up from 10%. Also part of the new ordinance is what we call a trainee apprentice goal. So, for example, and those goals directly mirror the overall goals of 51, 40, and 12. For example, if you have a contractor that has 10 employees and 2 of those employees are apprentices, we're looking to see and to make sure that those 2 apprentices fall within the categories that we're seeking, the 51, 40, and 12. Also, there's another compliance department that the Boston Planning and Development Agency has. That agency monitors projects as well. That's a unit that's been in place for years, and I just want to recognize Mr. Peter Sasso, who's here, raise your hand, Peter, who's the director of the BPDA compliance. Under the new order, so what this does is projects that the BPDA projects are now subject to the Boston Employment Commission review. With the old ordinance, the projects that the BPDA had were not subject to the Boston Employment Commission. So far, they've had one project, BPDA has had one project that's subject to the current back under the new ordinance, and it's the pipe fitters project. Okay. Moving on. So, and also another aspect of the new ordinance is what we call the 7 compliance efforts. So these are 7 compliance efforts that were in the old ordinance, but they've been recognized as a key monitoring tool in order to enforce and make sure that people of color, Boston residents, and females are working on city projects. The first item that we have is attending pre-construction meetings. So all contractors that work on city projects are subject to attending pre-construction meetings at least 2 weeks before that contractor starts on site. If the contractor does not attend a pre-construction meeting, then they could be subject to a $300 fine. So moving on to payrolls. So we collect payrolls for each company, each contractor that works on city projects. The company is required to submit us payrolls. And that's the way that we determine whether a company is making an effort to meet the goals or not. So there's what we call a cumulative fine on payrolls. So we expect those payrolls to be within our office within 7 business days. If those payrolls arrive after 7 business days, then they would be subject to a $300 fine per day. The next item is attending corrective action meetings. So when you have companies that are not complying for whatever reason, it could be because of paperwork submission, it could be because of low numbers. We invite them in to have a corrective action meeting to explain the process and any type of issues pertaining to getting workers or submitting payrolls or whatever the issue is. There's a $300 fine if that company does not show up to that corrective action meeting per contractor. We have the Boston Employment Commission meeting. That's a 7-member board. We have these meetings every month. We invite contractors and projects to that meeting. If you have a contractor or a developer that does not show up to that meeting, it's a $300 fine. So we also have providing communications and confirmations. So that would include workforce projections, workforce request forms, and other compliance items. If we do not receive those items, that contractor could be subject to a $300 a day fine. We have a jobs bank. So when you have workers that walk on to jobs, we're expecting to see those applications within our office. We have a jobs bank coordinator. If we find or think that company is not taking applications, submitting those applications to contractors that employ that worker, if we're not getting those applications back in the office, then that also could lead up to a $300 a day fine. So Boston residents, so we have Boston residents that work on these projects, and each Boston resident that works on these projects need to be verified. They would submit a copy of a driver's license, or utility bill. There's like 3 or 4 different items they can submit in order to verify that they live in Boston. So if we're not receiving those verifications, they also could be subject to a $300 a day fine in that category as well. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Sharice Hearns, the Deputy Director, and she's going to talk about the compliance monitoring.
At this point, I'd like to recognize Councilor Ayanna Pressley, Vice Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, councilors. Sharice Hearns, Deputy Director. I'm just going to go over the monitoring process with you. So we receive the Boston Residents Contract Employment Plan, which is basically the contract that a developer is given or signed to let them know that their project would be monitored by the BRJP office. That's what starts our interaction with each developer for each project. Once that documentation is received, the monitor and the BRJP manager would then do a kickoff meeting with the developer to discuss all preliminary concerns, issues. They discuss the process, everything that will be monitored, all the details of how the monitoring is done. Then they also have a pre-construction meeting. That pre-construction meeting then brings in all of the subcontractors that are going to be working on that project, as well as the general contractor, to again go over all the regulations, the BRJP policy, the way that the pre-constructions are held, kickoff. It just explains everything about how the project would be monitored moving forward. Once the construction starts on the project, there's several things that begin as far as the communications and confirmations that Chris just talked about, and several things start to happen. They submit weekly payrolls, the BEC reviews start to happen, the monitors are visiting the site on a regular basis, those corrective action meetings start happening, and quarterly reviews start to happen. During that process, that's pretty much when the construction is going on from 25% all the way to about 75%, almost 100% complete on the project. What we're looking for is then the certificate of occupancy to let us know that the project would then be getting ready to close out. We would do a project closeout meeting with them, and at that point, the monitoring of the project would stop. I'm going to let Chris then explain the next phase to you.
Thank you, Sharice. So let's talk about some of the projects that are under the new ordinance. So far we've had approximately 47 different projects that are that have been or are currently active that are subject to the new ordinance.
Chris, can I ask just one question? How are projects, how do they come under our purview? Like how,
right.
What trips something to have us monitor the work?
All right, so for the larger projects, it would be through the Article 80 process,
okay.
The submission of the project notification form.
Okay, so everything Article 80 is monitored.
If the submission of the project notification form is after January 25th, 2017, then that project would be subject to the new ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
For the housing projects, it's just currently the different line departments put out projects at different times, and so essentially if a project goes out today, then they would be subject to the new ordinance.
So under Article 80, we're not monitoring those projects?
We are. We're monitoring within the Article 80 process. There's two forms. There's the what we call a large project review and a small project review. And
Large project being over 50,000, small project being under 25, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So again, it's all subject to that project notification form. If that form is submitted after January 25th, 2017, then that project is subject to the new ordinance.
Chairman Baker, besides the Article 80 projects, I also want to call to attention that we also monitor all city-funded projects at any
Okay.
size.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
All right, no problem. So 47 47 projects have been under the new ordinance either, and I think most are active. There are some that have completed, but giving you the breakdown, so there has been two projects, private projects over 50,000 square feet. That would be the pipe fitters project, which the Boston BPDA monitored. I think it's about 80% complete, and we also have a BU project that we're currently monitoring. It's about 10% complete. Those are the two private projects that we have. So there has been 45 City of Boston projects under the Public Facilities Department, 17, Parks and Rec, 11, Public Works, 8, Neighborhood Development, 8, and Property Management, we've had 1 project. All right? So now we have some numbers. So these numbers are because we didn't have an annual review from October to April, I believe. We just, so this is a combination of the two biannual city council meetings. So we just put the numbers together instead of for 6 months, for a year.
Just to clarify for those in the audience, as this ordinance was passed, it required 2 meetings, and it specifically states 1 in April and 1 in October. We did not have the meeting in April. We're going to rectify that to make sure that going forward it happens. And so we're now in October, so you're giving us the culmination of them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Can I just interject here for a second? I need to step out now, and I'm going to pass the gavel off to Council Presley, my vice chair. I will be back if I can. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the new ordinance, under the new ordinance projects for the last year. We're really just getting under the way with these new ordinance projects. I would say that the projects that we're monitoring now, I would say an estimate is about 25%, 20 to 25% of the projects are under the new ordinance. Some are still under the old ordinance. They have to go through the processing. But most projects now that are starting are within the new ordinance. So for the new ordinance projects, 168,000 hours, 40% Boston resident, 51% people of color, 6% female. Those are the numbers for the 47 projects that are under the new ordinance. 40% resident, 51% people of color, 6% female. In regards to all projects, and this would include projects that are under the old ordinance and projects that are under the new ordinance. Going back 1 year, 6,300,000 hours. The average for Boston residents, 28%. People of color, 34%. And for women, 5%.
Have off the top of their head, sorry, Vice Chair, through the Vice Chair, does anyone have off the top of their head the old numbers before the new numbers?
Sure. I mean, in percentages?
Yes.
Right. So for residents, it was 50%. For people of color, 25%. And for women, 10%.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to move on to corrective action meetings. We have corrective action meetings when contractors are out of compliance, and it could be several different areas because of numbers, low Boston resident numbers, low female, low people of color. It could be because they're not submitting payrolls or other documentation. The monitor, it all starts with the monitor. The monitor schedules the meeting, and corrective action could be in the form of an email or a meeting. It usually starts with an email. And if the company doesn't provide the necessary documentation, or if it's not sufficient, then it could lead to a meeting. At these meetings, we invite business agents to the meetings. We've had good success in inviting business agents because especially for union contractors, because that's where that contractor gets its workforce. They have to go to the union, and so we want to make sure that the business agents are present, so it cuts out the back and forth. So we've had success in that area, and really the business agents appreciate the fact that we invite them to these meetings. Developer GC must bring all supporting documentation to that meeting. So if no one's in the union hall, they must get a letter from the union hall, from the business agent stating that no one's available. Also, we're asking contractors to reach out to organizations that we work with, Building Pathways, Youth Build Boston. It's just not the end of it if the person is not in the union hall. We're asking that company to make an extra effort because most of these companies are repeat companies, and we're going to see them again. And it's really about jobs, and we have to start making sure that we make sure that all companies diversify and make an effort to train and retain.
Just want to add to the corrective action toolkit. We also have, through the new ordinance, the ability to sanction, levy fees to the projects based on the 7 compliances that are defined in the ordinance.
I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Kim Odom.
Hold on 2 seconds, Chris. Let me talk a little bit about partnerships. We mentioned some partners earlier, and it's important that I think, as it was begun, that it's a partnership. This work is going to happen because of a strong partnership with the council and also a strong partnership with community members. And wanted to call some of them out clearly up here: Dorchester, Roxbury Labor Committee, union contractors, Youth Build, Building Pathways, Operation Exit, Policy Group on Tradeswomen, and Build a Life Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin Institute, Boston Jobs Coalition was also acknowledged earlier, business agents, Black Economic Justice Institute acknowledged earlier, DC 35, the Painters Union's partnership at Madison Park, and then a number of non-union contractors that all take this very seriously and have been working with us. The partnerships are important. Developing new and stronger partnerships is something that we all need to focus on, and look forward to working with the council on that. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to our Boston Employment Commission coordinator, Kim Odom.
Good afternoon, councilors. I'm going to say it again. My name is Kim Odom. I am the Boston Employment Commission coordinator. If I can just give a little overview of what the BEC is the Boston Employment Commission is a 7-member board. It was established by an ordinance passed by the City Council on July 30th, 1986, and signed by the Mayor of the City of Boston. The commission was created for the purpose of ensuring that findings with respect to compliance of the Boston Residents' Jobs Policy are determined in a manner that is comprehensive, consistent, and fair for all parties involved. Meetings are held third Wednesdays of each month. A public notice is posted on the city's website 1 week prior to the hearing. BRJP construction monitors make recommendations of projects to go on the agenda, and the agenda is prepared with consideration to the project size, duration, dollar amount, developer and GC history, and more. Notification letters are emailed to the developers, GCs, and includes a back fax sheet, which is a frequently asked questions sheet that gives overview of what BEC is, how to prepare, and what to expect. The developer and the GC is expected to plan to attend with requested subcontractors, and the monitors prepare BEC reports, which include stats of top 5 trades, top 5 contractors, highlights and concerns and recommendations, and that is emailed to the developer and GC 1 week prior to the hearing. During the hearing, special presentations, which usually we have about 2 to 3 special presentations on the agenda. The special presentation is just to introduce the project and is usually a 3 to 5 minute presentation. The project review is to show how the project is performing overall, and usually there are about 4 to 5 project reviews on the agenda, which take about 5 to 10 minutes of presentation. And then there's about 10 to 15 minutes that the commission will ask questions of those giving those presentations. The DIP projects are reviewed starting at the 25% mark. DIP meaning Developmental Impact Project Plan. Those are the private projects. Developer and GC is expected to be prepared to discuss any concerns listed in the notification letter and the BEC report. Monitors are expected to present the BEC report, and they give overall numerical compliance, highlights and concerns and recommendations, and whatever else might be current that day. After the hearing, the developer and GC is expected to perform action items that have been recommended by the BEC, and the monitors are expected to follow up with the developer and GC within 1 week, and I assist in that as well.
Thank you, Kim. Before I pass it on to Chairman Watson, I wanted to recognize in an earlier response to Chairman Baker's question around what triggers our compliance, what triggers the ordinance, and particularly the new numbers, the dates around the numbers. The only project that filed before the date referenced by Chris that is under the new ordinance is the Winthrop Square Garage project. Madam Vice Chair, if you remember when that project was being reviewed, they voluntarily subjected themselves to the new numbers prior to the date of the ordinance, and so they are currently under the new ordinance and not the old ordinance. At this point, the final member of our presentation is Chairman Watson, who is one of the commissioners for the Boston Employment Commission.
Travis Watson, Chair, Boston Employment Commission. Vice Chair Presley, Councilor Janey, Councilor Edwards, thank you for the invitation to be here today. As Chair of the Boston Employment Commission, I assist the Mayor's Office of Economic Development, specifically the Equity and Inclusion Unit, to maximize the participation of Boston residents, people of color, and women on private and public development projects in the City of Boston. The ordinance and the Mayor's executive order establish the Boston Employment Commission, BEC, as the liaison committee to make recommendations to BRJP and BPDA regarding enforcement of the ordinance. The commission meets the third Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. in room 801 at Boston City Hall to review BRJP and BPDA reports. The commission is made up of 7 members selected by the mayor. The commission has a lot of work to do to ensure that the economic growth of our city is one that provides inclusion and equity for all of Boston's residents. We have made great strides in recent years with more work to come. However, I want to be very clear here. The economic development of our city and inclusiveness are not mutually exclusive. At the same time, it's important to recognize the unique time we find ourselves in that positions us ahead of many other comparable cities struggling with similar issues. We have leadership from the top with Mayor Walsh's economic and inclusion agenda. We have an amended Boston residents jobs policy, and now developers proposing to develop city-owned parcels must include a diversity and inclusion plan in their proposals. We have an engaged city council that in 2017 passed equity and opportunity for city contracting. We have an active community participation and monitoring of construction sites, and some funders of construction projects now require the involvement of residents, people of color, women, and minority and women-owned firms as part of their financing criteria. That, plus the construction boom that we find ourselves in, equals a special moment. One of the Commission's #1 goals should be helping our contracting world join us as we work towards being on the right side of history, one that ensures an equitable and inclusive construction and development industry. It was a significant statement from Mayor Walsh when he amended the BRJP ordinance in 2017. Community activists are excited about the ability of the Commission to sanction contractors for noncompliance. However, creating access and opportunity for our residents, people of color, and women is more nuanced than merely sanctioning those who are noncompliant. The amended jobs ordinance has laid the groundwork for a unique approach to the work at the BEC with an emphasis on a collaborative approach to the work. Sanctions are an excellent tool and a welcome addition to the ordinance, as many contractors have gotten a little too comfortable with stern warnings. Sanctions don't create jobs, but they're there if needed. More importantly, the new sanctions have brought developers and contractors to the table with a sense of urgency to work on better compliance with the BRJP goals, which in turn will help ensure that Boston's economic development will benefit all of its residents. I honestly see the sense of urgency as the most significant win so far, as it's substantial. Construction, like any business, at the end of the day, is all about relationships. The more that we can help build these relationships with workers, contractors, advocacy groups, training programs, unions, and apprentice shops, the better positioned the city will be to continue to be a leader in inclusive and diversity in the trades. Another critical aspect of this work is community oversight. I can't stress this enough. Resident activists like Janet Jones, who's here today. Janet, would you please raise your hand? Volunteer hundreds of hours to monitor city projects. Even with the added capacity that Mayor Walsh has added to the equity and inclusion team in the Office of Economic Development, with the construction industry as busy as it is, you can never have enough eyes on a project ensuring that residents, people of color, and women are working in accordance to the BRJP. If there's a project in Dorchester or Roxbury, Janet, on her own time, free of charge, and for the greater good of the city, will make sure that BRJP goals are met, and if not, she will make sure that the BEC knows. Janet attends practically every BEC meeting in addition to many other construction oversight committees. This work is all about collaborations. The union building trades have been another great ally. Brian Doherty, Secretary, Treasurer, and General Agent, and many business agents attend the BEC meetings and are there to help connect their members with contractors in need of workers to meet the goals of the BRJP. A big part of the work of the BEC is finding out what projects are not in compliance with their BRJP goals and rubric and holding those accountable. Equally as important as the who is the why. Making connections between poorly performing projects and resources is essential. Not to oversimplify things, but I always remind contractors that it was a business decision to work in Boston. Particularly today, in a booming industry, contractors have a lot of choices where they work. But if you're in Boston, the expectation is that you comply with their BRJP goals. I stress that, 1, we are merely holding them accountable to what they signed up for, and 2, we want to help them meet the goals, and we're here as a resource. A large part of the work is that of a convener. It's about getting people together in a room, putting individual egos aside, and working together to address challenges and needs. Sometimes it's as easy as contractor A meet business agent X. Other times, it's more nuanced and takes an understanding of the broader industry and the challenges that some trades face. I will now speak on 2 lists. The first highlights what I have seen as keys to the BEC being able to increase residents, people of color, and women working on construction projects in the city. The second list outlines what I see as significant challenges to the work. First, I'm going to start with the keys to success. As I mentioned earlier, the leadership from our elected officials has been tremendous. Second, the BRJP staff has been outstanding. 3, knowledgeable commissioners, not just on real estate development, but key partners with experience in workforce development world. 4, programs like Building Pathways, Operation Exit, Youth Build Boston, Build a Life MA, partnerships work, which is the collaboration between IUPAT, DC 35, the Painters and Glazers Employers Association of New England, and Madison Park Vocational High School, and IBEW Local 103 and Millennium Partners Boston's social media campaign targeted toward women and people of color. And finally, partnerships and collaborations. Now on to the challenges. Repeat bad customers continue to be a challenge. Some of these companies continue to be awarded contracts even though they have performed poorly with the goals of the BRJP, many being awarded through the file subbid system. File subbid, a public procurement law not specific to the BRJP office, allows contractors that don't meet the BRJP goals to work in Boston. Worse, it will enable repeat offenders to continue to win bids. At the end of the day, with change orders, the contractors that win via file subbid often cost more than other firms that bid, usually firms with better track records with meeting goals of the BRJP. 2, while I understand that it's the nature of the work, not knowing what the total number of workers is, residents, people of color, and women, makes determining compliance complicated. It's working on a problem without a denominator. We don't have a baseline. For example, say a project has 100 carpenters on site. If the goal is 40% people of color, that means we expect around 40 people of color on site. However, because we don't know how many people of color are in each trade, it's tough to determine whether 40 people of color is realistic. 3, it's good to think that the industry is booming. However, as a result, it's tougher for projects to meet their goals. Now is the time to focus on training the next generation of workers, and it's why programs like Building Pathways, Operation Exit, and Youth Build Boston are so important. We need more focused investments in these programs. Female participation continues to be a challenge. The casinos are an excellent model that I hope is replicated in other projects. The Policy Group on Tradeswomen's Issues and Build a Life MA are allies in this part of the work. We need to be strategic while we introduce people to careers in construction and be prepared to support them when the industry inevitably slows down. Residents, people of color, and women brought into the trades to help the industry be more inclusive cannot be the first people out of work when things slow down. Shifting gears a bit, and as I wrap up, I will briefly explain the trim tab principle, one of the guiding principles of my work as chair of the Boston Employment Commission. The great design scientist Buckminster Fuller used the image of a large ocean-going ship traveling at high speed through the water to explain the trim tab principle. The mass and momentum of the vessel are enormous, and significant force is required to turn its rudder and change the ship's direction. In the past, some large ships had, at the trailing edge of the main rudder, another tiny rudder, the trim tab. By exerting a small amount of pressure, one person could easily turn the trim tab. The trim tab then turned the rudder, and the rudder turned the ship. Every system has one or more places where the leverage of trim tabs can be applied. Trim tabs may be the physical artifacts or manifest themselves as social innovations, policies, or programs. Each construction project has a trim tab or trim tabs that will help it meet the goals of the BRJP ordinance and ensure that we are creating an inclusive and equitable construction industry. It's up to us to identify and to use them. The time is now. Mayor Walsh, his administration, the Boston City Council, community activists, and funders are all working to ensure that today's booming construction industry provides meaningful employment to Boston residents, people of color, and women. The challenge is for us to work together and maximize this unique, incredible situation. It's easy to be critical about projects not meeting the BRJP goals, and we should not let them off the hook easily. But if we take a step back, Mayor Walsh has helped position us to make real inroads to inclusion and diversity in the construction industry and ensure that Boston's economic growth is both inclusive and equitable for all its residents. The work of the BEC is not just about doing the right thing. It's about recognizing that we as a city have an opportunity to change residents' lives for the better and help transform the way an industry or profession does business by holding projects accountable to their BRJP goals. Thank you for this opportunity. I welcome your feedback, questions, and comments.
That concludes our presentation. We look forward to answering your questions.
All right, well, I'll begin with the lead sponsors of today's hearing order. So Councilor Edwards, and then, let's see, yeah? Okay.
Do you have a time constraint?
You go ahead. You have a terrible.
Okay, so
I've
Council,
got some things that I just wanted to kind of address from the presentation
okay.
as well.
I wanted to thank you for your presentation, incredibly informative and very, very helpful in shaping. You answered some of the questions I had. You lost me a little on the ship analogy. I don't know what a trim tab is. I'm sorry. So, but I get the overall gist is that it's a wave effect. It's the impact is for many people, and I appreciate your breaking down, especially where you're finding the opportunities and what's working well, and also where the challenges are. Because I think, being totally honest, we should be totally transparent. Again, all having the same goal. We're here to work together to figure out how we support each other. So thank you so much. I have a couple questions regarding the punishments or the incentivizing, I guess, if you want to call it. And I wonder, I know it's set by statute, but do you find that some people find it's just cheaper to pay that than to comply with the ordinance? I mean, is it ultimately you can find somebody and they're very, very rich people, but should the fines increase maybe? And then also, is there a certain point where you just say, no, you can't come back anymore?
So I think you are, I'm going to address your second part of this first, which is there a point where we can say to someone,
A repeat offender,
you can no longer do business in Boston? And I think we look forward to having a further conversation with you and how we can create tools in the procurement process, in the contracting process, to be able to do that as a city. On your first question, I think we can attest to the ordinance, at least by the numbers, and the teeth to the ordinance creating urgency and creating responsiveness, where the commission recommended we look at a couple of projects for fining, for sanction. And in fact, what we did was we brought them in. We told them specifically, I want to be specific to one project, Dudley Library, which is the case I was using. We brought them in and said, you're about to get fined. What they did was dramatically change their behavior in providing us all the documentation that was missing and being super responsive. And in fact, which I wasn't expecting, their numbers dramatically increased. And so, not having had even sanctioned them, the threat to sanction proved to be super effective. We do, however, anticipate fining people very shortly under the new ordinance. And so we will have better, in April when we come back to you, we'll have better data on how they've responded to that. But today what we can tell you, given the interactions with GCs on the corrective action meetings, they have responded to the ability to fine in the new ordinance.
Thank you. So I'm curious, one of the biggest issues I also find with the wealth disparity is wages and wage theft. And I know that we have an ordinance on the books, an executive order actually, that Mayor Walsh also pushed through that applies to projects that are $25,000, I think. So it's actually more expansive than the BEC. And my concern, or what I'm curious, is your communication about wage theft and repeat offenders in that realm. What I would hate to see is that a person is complying by having 51% of folks from Boston exceeding with folks of color over 40%, exceeding with women, but not paying them, right? So how are you talking with the way, I know that they have their own enforcement, so I'm not asking you about how you're going to enforce on that. I'm not asking about your enforcement. I'm asking about your communication to make sure that someone who doesn't pay their workers but manages to meet all the demographics that we want doesn't slide under your realm.
So typically right now, the only place that we see the wage violations would be on a city-run project. And it's not necessarily a repeat offender situation. But part of what our office does is make sure that if there is a wage violation discovered, that we go after the contractors to make sure that they actually pay the monies owed to the worker.
Yeah, so the repeat offender question, I think, is the same. We would still need the same effort that we talked to earlier. to
So
adjust some
let
of.
me, give me an example of what I, maybe, because I know that you have also that under your office, so I don't want it to be seen as a separate conversation. Could someone who's compliant with BEC and maybe exceeding BEC standards, but but violating the wage theft ordinance, how
Yeah.
is BEC
Yeah.
notified about that or not?
Yeah, at this point, unless, Kim, I'd ask you to correct me if I'm wrong, there is no communication to the
Okay.
BEC. And that's
So
a great question.
That's
Yeah,
something
I get
that
it.
could be rectified, I
Yep.
think.
Yep.
You know, obviously, it's just what we don't want is someone who's making the standards by not paying people of
Yeah,
color
right,
or
sure.
Boston residents, right? So, and I think that's great that your office handles both, so I think it's an easy way to coordinate the communication. So, and I'll turn over shortly, if that's okay. But just one last question. And when it comes to women in the industry, and one of the challenges that I've also heard outside of the challenges that you've listed has to do with childcare and access to affordable childcare on site. Now, I know that asking folks to do something extra is not necessarily what the BEC can do as in provide childcare facilities or credits or whatever. But you had mentioned that you try to assist and bring them to the table. Maybe that's a question or a line of questioning you might consider for some of the locals, the business agents, the folks. You know, how are you assisting or working with to assure that childcare is part of your recruitment at all? Because again, I think they turn to you for your leadership, like, help us. We want to have those numbers. But I do think you know, having a conversation that includes that might be worth it for you when they're genuinely, not the bad actors, when they are genuinely looking at you. And I think they look to your leadership for help and how we're going to meet those numbers. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues for now.
I would just, absolutely, and I think the one thing that I've heard in addition to the affordability is the hours in which the daycare providers are in operation. Oftentimes, many of them start at 6:30 or 7 is opening. Many of our tradesmen and women need to be on site a lot earlier than that. So in addition to the affordability, it's hoping, working with the hours to be a little bit more accommodating as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Counselor Janey?
Yeah, so in my opening remarks, what I failed to mention were the compliance officers, the monitors themselves, who are great partners in this work. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. And today we have, oh, did he just leave? So Robert was just here. So I definitely want to acknowledge the important work that they're doing. I wanted to come back to the Dudley Library project. You had mentioned earlier, Chief Barrows, that you know, these meetings started to take place and suddenly they got their act together. And I think it's very important to highlight the work of the activists and the partnership and what BEC has done, because they didn't magically get their acts together. And in fact, their acts are still not together. It was the April BEC meeting when I first saw you in action, and certainly Janet was there, that I decided to bring the Dudley Library as well as Vine Street before the monitoring committee so that we could keep eyes on that. And so any improvement that we've seen, I think, is a direct result of folks actually putting some eyeballs on their numbers. I show up unannounced to their job site all the time. I've let it be known to them that if you know a new company is coming on site, if they don't have the numbers, they shouldn't come on site. And I'm going to show up at 7 a.m. to see, in fact, if they come on site, and if they do, if they're coming on site with the right workers. So I think it's important just to kind of clarify that. Now, you mentioned Dudley Library as an example. Is that $12.8 million that we're talking about? And this is a city-owned project, so I also want to make that known, that these, both Vine Street and Dudley Library were city-owned projects, and we're talking about people not being in compliance. We're talking about the city not being in compliance. And so when you talk about Dudley Library being threatened with fines,
Right.
Who's actually getting the fine?
So first, I want to be clear that this work is done in collaboration and
Exactly.
partnership with the council. And Councilor Janey, we appreciate your leadership. It was really important in calling out the Dudley Library. So I think there were a lot of actors in on that one, and want to appreciate the community activists and want to appreciate the BEC and Robert was ringing the bell. Everybody was ringing the bell on that
Exactly.
one, right? And then I wanted to highlight that I do believe the new ordinance gave us a stronger tool to call Dudley to task. You ask an important question. Within the city of Boston, there are departments that are managing these projects and are responsible for carrying out these projects. Some of the more difficult work that my staff has to do and that I have to do is call those departments to task. And so we've begun internal meetings with city departments to have conversations on their role in making sure that there is compliance. And in fact, we had alerted everyone at City Hall, up and down the chain, that we were finding Dudley Library.
Excellent.
In
And
fact,
so
and I think
who
you
gets the
also
fine,
know-
though? Who gets the fine?
Huh?
Who gets the fine?
The GC gets the fine.
Okay.
The GC gets the fine. And so, in fact, I think you also know that we had alerted everyone that we were stopping the Vine Street project. Vine Street was out of compliance. They weren't being responsive. And so we went to the community. And we started with the community meeting and alerted the folks at Mount Pleasant, Vine Street, that we were shutting down the Vine Street project. Brought them in and had a conversation. And so you're absolutely correct. These projects, most of the projects under the new ordinance are city projects. We will be finding a city project.
And so, for me, very important that the city play a leadership role.
Absolutely.
And that the city, in fact, adhere to the standard. And it's very difficult then to hold private development accountable if the city isn't doing the same. So I certainly appreciate your leadership and that it does take collaboration and partnership. And so certainly, I mean, that was the first time I saw you, Travis, was calling them to task and decided to bring them before the community to do the same. So certainly appreciate that. Robert, you missed the shout out I gave you, but you're back. So if you would just wave and say thank you. I mean, I'm saying thank you to you. I want to start with the money. So you mentioned earlier that it's $9 billion, so billion with a B, active development, and $6.8 billion that is in the pipeline. So more than 15 billion construction dollars. And we often look at the construction hours, how many of the hours are going to residents, people of color, women. We absolutely should. But I'm very much interested in how much of this money is going to residents, people of color, and women, particularly when we're talking about MBEs and WBEs. And so right now, I know we don't track that, but I think it's very important to track that. So I could have 100 hours going to people of color and 10 hours that are not going to people of color. And those 10 hours could be worth more money on the table than those 100 hours. So I'd like for the city to get to the point where we're actually tracking how much of this $15 billion is going to Boston residents, people of color, and women.
Right. Thank you. We will work on that. We will begin to work on that. I think we are with the new diversity language in the RFPs, diversity and participation language in the RFPs, we will be able to come back and give you on city-owned land specific numbers on that question. We are tracking it. We've asked for it. We are now weighing it, and in fact, we'll be selecting upon that criteria. Really, really important. On the private
I'm
side.
sorry, if I could just interject for one
Yes,
moment.
sure.
So we're all here because we agree that that which gets measured gets done. And so to foster a culture and a climate here of transparency and accountability, what you're doing today is the same thing that we are asking of, that was written into the legislation for Millennium and Winthrop, also for the MBE procurement and contracting ordinance that Councilor Wu and I authored and was passed. And so I know that we're working on a hearing for you to come and present on the council for both of those projects, so that ordinance and that project as well. So I do think we'll get to that. And that has been codified as a part of the language. So we have that prompt of transparency and that accountability in real time, all the time. So.
Right, and I appreciate certainly your work and your leadership along with Councilor Wu. but I want to make sure that we're building it in as we talk about construction dollars. Certainly, we need to be looking at all the MBEs and WBEs and all the money that the city spends and who's getting that. And so I certainly appreciate your work. I just want to know that when I'm monitoring this every other week with the community, that it's not, that I'm not just looking at hours. I want a breakdown of dollars. I want to know where that money's going and who's getting that money. That $15 billion is a lot of money. I think the pipeline piece, very important, and I'm glad, I think everyone highlighted that, and I mentioned it in my opening. But we have to do both. We have to hold folks accountable now as well as build the bench. My worry is that by the time we get the bench built, that this boom is going to be gone.
Yeah.
And so that $15 billion that we're talking about, we need to make sure that people are participating in an equitable way in that $15 billion. So let me just ask some questions, and I know my colleagues may have additional questions, and we certainly want to take testimony from those who are here in the audience. So you mentioned earlier sanctions and fines. I'd like to get an understanding of how many folks have been asked to pay fines. And you mentioned, Chief, you mentioned Dudley Library specifically, but how many folks have been brought in and sanctioned or have been asked to pay fines?
Under the new ordinance, we have not fined yet.
And why is that? So let's back up. How many corrective action meetings or emails have we had under the new ordinance?
Well, for example, on the Dudley project, a combination of emails and meetings, Claudette Austin, who's the direct monitor for that project, it turned out to be 45 different communications, either by email or by meeting.
And I should shout out Claudette as well as Stacy, who is not here, so thank you for that. So what has to happen, so then what happens after that? So just take us through the process. So you have a corrective action meeting. Do people suddenly get their acts together in terms of submitting payrolls or meeting the numbers? What happens?
Yeah. So like Chief Barrow stated, with this new ordinance, no one wants to get fined. So, for example, the Dudley project, we brought them in, we met with them, they came in front of the back, we explained to them, listen, you're in violation, you're going to get fined. And directly afterwards, the payroll started being submitted on time, and we also saw an increase in numbers as well.
And when you say the Dudley project, do you mean the Dudley Library?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And we all acknowledge that while there have been some improvements with their numbers because everyone from internally and externally are monitoring, do we also acknowledge, though, that they are still way below their numbers? Yes?
That's true.
And where are they currently?
Well, overall, currently, overall, from the beginning of the project to date.
Chris, I've got numbers here. You just check your numbers, but I have numbers right here. There's still overall residence numbers at 26%.
As of now.
As of now. People of color, 46%. Women, 5%.
Okay. I think also important, while the overall numbers on projects, whether they've improved over time, and we look at totals, sometimes the total numbers are looking good. Still, trade by trade, there's a lot of work. There are certain companies who continue to get jobs in the city who are not, that we all know don't meet the requirements and are not making the numbers. So there are some folks who come in, and they come in quick. They're only there for a short period of time, not a lot of work hours, and then they're out. So even before someone has a report generated and can look, they're already off the job. But we know from history that they're bad players. So what can be done about someone like that? And why aren't people getting fines when we know that there are bad players or sanctions?
Yeah, so we're walking out the corrective action process first, right? And on Dudley, they weren't responsive. And so because they weren't responsive, we got a recommendation to fine. We presented that recommendation with, in fact, how much we were going to fine. We called them in that we were going to fine, and immediately they responded with all the documents. They, checked all the boxes. And we were ready to fine on Dudley because we feel like there were enough meetings, there were enough people that had reached out. We given them some resources. So we were ready to fine. We were ready to fine. And then they changed their tune and changed their behavior. I anticipate there will be fines shortly because we've now had enough time to do emails, meetings, calls with the BA, calls with the subs, meetings with the subs, right? So we feel like we have enough, and we're doing great documentation so that when we are challenged, we can show that we've been trying to work with people. And it's not just about going in and fining and justify the fines. We have not fined yet, but I anticipate in April presenting, unfortunately, some fines to you.
In April?
Because, yes, because I think that some folks are going to get fined.
And just a reminder, I'm sorry, that we cannot fine just based on the percentages. It has to be based on the compliance efforts.
Exactly, on this, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So how many GCs or developers have you threatened to fine or had to have these tough conversations and back and forth with the emails and the meetings?
Yeah.
Like what's that low-hanging fruit? So when you come back and report to the council in April, I'm assuming between now and then, there'll be some fines. Who are those folks? Or you don't have to name people specifically, but are there a number of people who, or companies that are going to be fined?
Yes, I want to go on record to say a couple of things. One is we have had corrective action meetings with GCs on a variety of projects, both covered by the old ordinance and the new ordinance. And on record, I'm being very consistent in letting all of them know that we will fine. It's not like we haven't fined under the old ordinance. And so I don't want to create any bifurcation or sense of people under the old ordinance that they get to kind of write off in the sunset, right?
I would agree. I think we need to hold everyone accountable.
And at the last hearing, I felt it was important enough to get in front of the GCs there and once again publicly state it doesn't matter whether you were on the old ordinance or new ordinance, because I felt like there was a little bit of, oh, I'm under the old ordinance, right?
I appreciate that. Let me continue to move on, Chief, if I may. So what is the system, assuming that we were collecting fines, where is that money going to go? Who gets to decide where the money goes? Is the money being used to kind of build the pipeline? Is it, if there are a lot of fines or people out of compliance in a certain neighborhood, would that money be used to kind of support the workforce development in that neighborhood? What's the system in place?
So right now, the system is that any fines would have to go to general fund, but we have talked and tried to see if once we start to accumulate a certain amount of money, if there's a proposal that we could make to actually have that money be shifted to go somewhere else.
Yeah, so
it'll go to a general fund.
Yeah, and I'd be interested in making sure that certainly it goes to workforce development, job training, that we're really focused on building the bench of folks, particularly, the women numbers, whatever project you look at, the women numbers tend to be always lower. And so there's a new data tracking system in place?
There's a new data tracking system that is being installed and implemented now.
Yeah. And how are folks engaged in that process in terms of some of you talked about the partnerships with community or
Yeah, it's that whole process is slower than I think anybody wants it to be. Unfortunately, there was some staff turnover in our technology department. It further slowed it down. It's back on track, but we still, I don't know if they've given us a new timeline on that?
Yeah, so we have a RFP out, and basically it's due by the end of October, so we should be hiring a consultant really soon and moving forward with implementation of Salesforce.
What is happening with the Jobs Bank? There's a new coordinator? There's someone who's doing that work?
There's a Jobs Bank coordinator, John Dunham. He's doing that work, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with him.
Okay, I'm going to leave that right there. What percentage of linkage money has been going to job training, specifically around construction jobs? Can anyone here answer
So we
that?
would have to get a report to look at construction jobs, but in general, the breakdown in linkage payments to the housing trust and the job trust, and don't quote me, and I'll get you the actual numbers, but it's something like $8 and something goes to the Affordable Housing Trust, and $1 something goes to the Workforce Trust, and I'll get you the actual numbers on that, Councilor.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested to see, what's going specifically to the construction side, just kind of to your point earlier around building the pipeline. One of the things that I've noticed in monitoring these construction sites, these projects, is that you've got folks who have their core crew. Maybe they bring on a woman, maybe they bring on a person of color or a resident to meet the requirements, and then they let the person go off to the next job. And so you see this shuffle of people who are being hired but then being let go because they, want to keep their core crew intact. And I understand that it's kind of a nuanced thing where if you're doing this work, you've got people you've been working with who you like their work, you've got a rapport, you know them, you trust them to get the job done, to show up on time, whatever it is. But how do we kind of cut through that to ensure that we're not playing this shuffle game around just hiring people temporarily to meet some sort of requirement and then going about your business elsewhere, and that people are not really having the opportunity to work on other jobs. Have you guys thought about that?
Right, so I think that's something that the monitors do an excellent job in. Most of these companies we see from project to project, so we know of companies that hire females. On the next project, we're looking at that company to make sure that that company still has that female and that that company's not checkerboarding, or that company's not just hiring a person to put some numbers on the paper and letting them go and moving on. So I think we're putting extra emphasis on tracking on companies and actually tracking workers and making sure that certain workers, that companies are training these workers and they're keeping these workers. So we see the same companies on all of our projects, and we're in the same meetings, and sometimes they're running into the same compliance monitor. So that's one way that we're able to ensure, or try to ensure that companies are putting forth an effort, a valid effort, to really keep trained individuals and have them be part of their core crew.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the work that you're doing in that area. I think what we have found, certainly in the monitoring committee meetings, is that they're not keeping and adding folks to the core crew. It's kind of this temporary thing, and I just wonder how we kind of cut through that. And, maybe, we need more time to kind of think about what some of those solutions might be. But, and I'm certainly glad that your office is thinking about that. But that's, one of the things that we see is that folks, perhaps they're bringing on someone, but it's kind of a temporary thing for this particular job site, and then the person is cut loose. And so, they're missing out on an opportunity to kind of really build and hone in on their own skills and get, these dollars. We're talking about $15 billion, right?
We're talking more than that. You're
Exactly.
right. Yeah, 15 billion would include there's 9.3 billion on the ground. There is 6.8 that we've approved in this calendar year, and then, Counselor, I have to go look at the numbers. I think there's another 10, 11 million that's been approved and hasn't broken ground yet. So I just wanted to make sure I was presenting this correctly.
Exactly. Anyway, I think I'll pause for now. I can always come back with additional questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Oh, please. One clarifying question in terms of how folks are checkered or put in their boxes. So I go to work under the BEC, right? I'm a woman of color. So would an employer be able to kind of double dip in that I made my woman quota, and then I've also made my person of color quota? So instead of she counts for the women, so we're going to have to make added effort to increase people of color. How does that work? Because I've been, when folks will tell me, like, we have, half of our folks are people of color, half of them are women, and you'll go in there and it's, I'm not upset to see a bunch of, women of color holding it down, but I'm thinking, wait a second now, you could have had a bigger number. So my for those of us that qualify to
Councilor
vote,
Edwards,
how do
you would count as a Boston resident, a woman, and a person of color.
So all
You would
these
check all
percentages
three.
get
Yes,
added.
Yes, ma'am.
But do you see what my concern is that if you put me under just one of them, then the amount of folks they have to go and recruit actually increases?
It does. It doesn't, sometimes it doesn't mean that it will, right? Because they need a certain amount, they need a crew that's a certain size. So they don't add on that crew to get to compliance. We just want to know what that crew is so that the crew is compliant. So
Well, no,
sometimes
but I mean,
there's
if you have a crew that's 10 people.
Right.
And you could shove me under 3 categories, right?
Right.
Versus having to hire 3 different people, you still may only have 10 jobs, but you've actually increased the amount of folks under this ordinance.
Because it's on a percentage basis, if you just got, 3 people, you're still underneath the quota, underneath the goals.
I think the point of it isn't the 10 or the 3, right?
Right.
The point is that folks, how you count those percentages can increase. So the percentages alone are not going to do it. Am I making sense? Like,
Yeah, so we'll further look into that.
no, it's okay. All right, so right now, I can fall under several boxes as opposed to putting me under one box, women, and then having to still increase or make the quota for people of color and Boston residents, right? Okay. And you see how, to me, that actually allows for an employer to do less under this ordinance. Do you see how I see that? No, you don't.
So we are presented
Does anyone
with,
see it, or am I just off on a crazy town?
No, we see it. We
Okay,
talk- It's
all right.
double, it's
Okay,
double
that's just it.
counting. It was actually going to be
I'm
my
not-
line of questioning. But it's double counting, and it's happened
It's triple
for
counting.
decades. It's,
Right.
so it's a very real.
I mean, but so that's, maybe we are not at that point where we can, and maybe just complying with what we got is our goal right now. But I really do, I always believe in above and beyond if we can one day. So let's put that out there.
thank you.
I just wanted to thank the makers of this order for their leadership and their vigilance and for your robust and thoughtful line of questioning. Most of my questions were asked and answered, but I'm just going to do a couple. And then I think we want to move to public testimony because folks have been very patient. But I can't say anything without first acknowledging the foundational work that's been done here. And I think it's very apropos that the 3 of us are sitting here. I want to just acknowledge Bruce Bowling and Chuck Turner and Charles Yancey and many more outside of this chamber that don't have a comma and an elected title after their name, like many of the groups that you named that have been a part of this and coalition. And we thank you for your partnership as well. But to my point about those that don't have an elected title but have still been vigilant in their work to make sure that we know every law is only as good as its enforcement. So to those who have been a partner in community and making sure that we are enforcing the law. Every budget cycle, I've initiated a letter and had colleagues sign on to push for a greater investment in compliance monitors that are in keeping and commiserate with the building boom that we're in the midst of. And I'm so appreciative of the community groups that are standing in the gap, but I would add that as much as I appreciate their benevolence, I wish they were getting paid for that. And so I just wanted to know, do we believe that right now our compliance monitors are commensurate with the level of building that we are doing. It's my recollection that the last time we were experiencing an unprecedented building boom, I think we had 10 monitors or 10 more than we have currently. So I just wanted to better understand what is currently allocated in the line item, what are those staffing levels, and is it something that we could explore, that these good people who are working so hard, that we might be able to compensate them for the role they're playing as monitors, sort of standing in the gap because of our own deficit staffing levels.
Thank you. It has been on the table as a topic of conversation with the advocates and those who help us look at the ordinance and the work that we do. We've gone back and forth about the, sort of the city's role and responsibility and what we really should, we owe our public, right,
Okay.
in terms of what we should be doing. I think beyond policy, we are advocates and have talked to some of the foundations that support the advocates we work
Okay.
with, because they call in and check in. So I just want to say, and I've never said it to the advocates, but foundations will call and they'll check in, and we are staunch advocates in saying these people are critical, not just for monitoring these sites and coming back and communicating, but also for their vigilance and their research around the things we're doing, other cities are doing, and comparing us and talking to their colleagues around the country. So I just want to, underscore the level of assistance that we get from our partners, but also recognizing that the city feels like we should step up and provide the kind of resources that we need to make sure that we are monitoring a city ordinance.
Okay. So since I won't have the honor of being a fiscal steward in our next budget process, but so you can't offer those projections, but could you share with me right now what are the staffing levels for compliance monitors? What is that budget line item?
So we have currently 6 monitors at, under the Boston Residents Jobs Policy, and an additional 3 monitors at the BPDA, so a total of 9.
Okay, and are these the highest levels we've ever had, or was there a time in history when we had more?
Well, I can answer that. I've been around here for about 25 years now, and I think this is toward the highest levels. I can't, yes, at least two more monitors than we've had in the past. And we also have additional support staff. It's just not the monitors. We also have additional support staff that's greater than we've had in the past.
Okay, and do we believe that these compliance monitors, I'm sort of asking a question I know the answer to, that they have the bandwidth, given the unprecedented building that we are undergoing, to monitor these projects effectively?
So we just added 2 monitors. We added a new program monitor to our team. I forgot to call out Jessica, who is sitting in staff right now. We just hired a new outreach coordinator and construction monitor. So, and through your help with the budget, we also was able to bring in a new director of the Equity and Inclusion Unit. So we have more capacity than we've ever had. However, we just met with budget on this question. And short of trying to do any kind of budget presentation to you today, I think we will have another conversation with you that looks at capacity, looks at the level of construction, and make sure that we continue to appropriately address the question from the city side and have the right staffing. I anticipate, Madam Vice Chair, that we will be looking at additional capacity in general for the Equity and Inclusion Office. I think some of that conversation will be dictated on the findings of the disparity study and what happens thereafter. And others will be dictated on the continued growth of our economy.
Okay. So getting back to the disparity point, since ultimately I think the goal here, when we talk about a more inclusive economy, is really not just about people getting an equitable piece of the proverbial pie, but an equity and opportunity to contribute to it. Not just to benefit from the city's prosperity, but to contribute to it. And ultimately, this is about addressing what we all espouse we care about, and that is the wealth and wage gap in this city, which continues to widen. And so from a workforce development, I'm very conflicted, and I look forward to public testimony because I feel like we have so many training and apprenticeship programs. And so I'm conflicted about if even it's more training that we need and really just more of a mandate and a strengthened pipeline to get people into these jobs. So I'm not really sure. But in the same way that our Boston Police Department is not representative of the city and overwhelmingly aging and non-ethnic, and we are having to be intentional about how to cultivate this next generation of police officers, which is why we have reinstated the Cadet Academy and things like that. I just wonder if we know that our population is going to be growing by 100,000 people by 2030, and we have goals and plans for around climate, around transit, around how much housing that we're building. We know we are going to need this workforce. So do we have workforce and training goals commensurate with the population growth and our building and our development? Yeah. And then how are we meeting that? Because programs like Operation Exit and Building Pathways and the great programs that are happening out of IBEW and things like that, ultimately, if we're not aggressive and intentional about the capacity growth of those efforts, we won't have this workforce. And I want to know specifically how Madison Park is factoring into all of this.
Mm-hmm. Right, so I want to agree with your assessment of the importance of workforce. I think oftentimes we talk about displacement and gentrification. We talk about access and affordability. We don't talk about financial mobility and financial stability and the importance of the wage gap, importance of the wealth gap, right? It's really an important factor in this. I want to also recognize the council's work in helping us move this along. So we have, I would say, with the new ordinance, with the new good jobs wording in our RFPs, we would frankly all like to see more having been done. I'd say Boston is a leader in all that we have done and in the players in the ecosystem in doing this. All that said, we need to hurry up, right? And city government moves slow and is deliberate, and we have to be so that we can be good stewards on behalf of the people. But this kind of hearing and our kind of partnership allows us to do that. That being said, there's a lot more to do. The mayor, in fact, increased the linkage money recently. A lot of that was driven on the fact that it is the only dedicated source that we have coming out of the construction boom for workforce development. And it is grossly, in my mind, this is the Chief of Economic Development speaking, that it is the proportion of money going to workforce development over affordable housing, which is critical, shows that the attention to this conversation of displacement and how we have anti-poverty approaches is disproportionate to creating access and opportunity around housing, which is important, and we need to do more around workforce development.
So right now, is it possible, so we don't have finite goals in terms of workforce development and training specifically for these trades?
Right.
Okay, so we have an investment in workforce development, but we're not necessarily counting. So we have so many community partners, and some might be graduating 30, and some are graduating 80, and some are, I wonder if that's something that, I don't know if that's the work of the job bank or what, but.
We look forward to having further conversations on this. I think to Chairman Watson's point, we might be able to count input, but without having real information on the baseline, okay, we don't know how much impact we're really having. And so we need to do more work in this area to be able to answer your question in a way.
And I just would underscore and again just make the request that we're intentional specifically about the role of Madison Park High School in this pipeline, along with all of the other community-based organizations which are doing incredible work. And I think just the last point, just picking up on Councilor Edwards' point. Oh, I'm sorry. Two quick things. There's a coalition of folks that Councilor Ross and I worked with for 2 years, and a lot of those folks then worked with you to amend the BRJP. And one of the things we pushed for were these recommendations from the tradeswomen group to be codified, these best practices. I did a quick look on the website, and I didn't see it there. I just wanted to make sure that we are, since it is easy for contractors to say that we can't find people, or we know you're propping up this project as a best case practice, but we don't know how to do what they did. And that was the whole reason, to get those best practices codified as a part of this ordinance. I just want to make sure that those best practices are readily available. And it's not up to does the contractor have to prompt and ask for these best practices, or how can we make those more readily available, those recommendations and those resources?
So we did definitely work with that group, PGGI, and
Yes.
try to incorporate a lot of what they had for best practice standards. We need to do a better job of making that available.
Okay.
That's the issue.
Okay, all right, and then the last thing is on the issue of childcare. We did actually end up establishing a working group, based on the insight that we did receive from Janet and others, that we had grown the number of women in the trades, building specifically. 50% of that workforce was now women of color. It was 3 times bigger than it had been, in large part because of the transparency that we brought through the amendment to the BRJP, prompting the BEC to have to put all this data online. But no child care. And we have, in the Massachusetts 7th, we have in Boston, almost 40% single female-headed households. And we want more women to see this as a viable path to self-sufficiency and economic mobility. But if these are single female-headed households, and even if they're not, the issue of childcare, we've been pushing other employers in new buildings, to create on-site childcare, but that's not an option for these sites because it isn't safe. And then again, the other issue of non-traditional, non-standard work hours. So we've trained these women, we've gotten them in, but then they can't keep the job because there's no provider that is working those hours. So we do have an ad hoc working group that's working on recommendations and things. We're working with providers on that, so welcome your partnership.
I'd love to join.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so Councilor Janey has one more thing, and then I swear we're moving to public testimony. We thank you all for your patience here. Obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover. Okay.
Yeah, so first I just want to thank you all again for the work that you're doing, and for partnering with community and really approaching this with some urgency. A couple of things. One, on the women workers, I wonder what is being done to not only ensure that there is training happening and that the child care is in place and all these other things, but really kind of that climate on the job. So one of the things that we see that these sites may not be the most welcoming, whether to people of color or to women. And I don't know if you're looking at that, but just making sure that when we do get women on the jobs, or if we get people of color, that they're in an environment where they feel safe and welcomed and can do the job, and that they're being supported. I had a specific question around the jobs bank. How many, what does that pool look like? How many people are in that pool? Are they actually getting hired? Like, what is happening with the jobs bank pool?
Right, so that pool mainly consists of laborers. We're not seeing skilled individuals who are reaching out, who are filling out that online application. Most are individuals who are working at a low-wage job, and they're looking for better pay, and they're seeing that construction might offer better pay. But we're not seeing skilled workers, we're seeing laborers, and we're not seeing a lot of them. I think per week, online application, maybe 2 individuals are filling out the online application. The jobs bank coordinator is intaking that person. We're calling them into the office. We're interviewing that person face to face. We're providing resources to that person. We're training them on how to sign up for unions. My thought is that, laborers, being a laborer is a good profession, but in my experience, those are the individuals that tend to be kind of let go. You know, we push companies to meet the goals, to go hire a person to carry wood for 2 weeks, and when the company finishes on a project, they move on and lay this person off. So we're encouraging individuals to get skills. Apply to be a plumber, apply to be a sprinkler fitter.
Now, do you refer them out to some of our labor organizations that have, you know, apprenticeship programs so that they can get skilled in one of these areas?
Yes, we do. We send them to Youth Build Boston. We send them to Building Pathways. We assess the person to see what they're interested in. So we have a range of resources that we're trying to send individuals to.
Okay. And then lastly, you know, the purpose of this is to kind of check in twice a year, kind of go through the numbers, see where we're doing a good job, and then see where things can be improved. And so if you have any kind of last thoughts, just really 90 seconds around maybe some low-hanging fruit or next steps that are solution-oriented, certainly interested. And if not now, you know, at a later date. This is an ongoing issue that we all need to be watching. So I'd certainly appreciate any insight that you'd want to leave us with in terms of solutions moving forward to increase residents, people of color, and women in these areas. And again, no pressure if you don't have anything now, but hope that we continue to think about that collectively. So I think now we're going to go to public testimony. If you want to call that first name.
Sure. So we have, and I'll call up, we don't have that many folks on this first. Sure, I'd love you to stay and listen.
If you
as
can,
well.
that would be
Thank
great.
you. But thank you.
Thank you.
So for public testimony, we have Priscilla Flint. We have Chuck Turner.
And we've got these two podiums.
And you can go ahead, yeah, go to the two microphones.
We have the two podiums right here.
Dick Monks and Don Carlson will also can go to the microphones behind either one.
Hello. My name is Priscilla Flint Banks, and I am co-founder of the Black Economic Justice Institute. I am the chair of the Boston Jobs Coalition. I am the co-chair of the Blue Hill Corridor Planning Commission, as well as a retired employee of the City of Boston. I'm also an author and a licensed minister. And I want to thank you both today for calling this hearing about the Economic Justice Commission, because it is very important. For the past 6 years, the Black Economic Justice, along with the Boston Jobs Coalition, has been fighting for good jobs in our community, construction and permanent jobs. We've led and joined several protests in Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, South End, East Boston, and Dorchester. We've made the community aware of noncompliance of the Boston resident job policy. We helped rewrite the BRJP new ordinance, and we are continuing to work with the BRJP office and the Beck Commission to ensure that it is enforced. We have been monitoring 7 construction project sites in Roxbury for the past 6 years. We know the needs of the community, and we are here today because of those needs. We are working together to ensure people from our community are on these job sites. We attend the Beck meetings and hear the excuses that come from the developers and contractors about why they are not in compliance. We attend the Beck meetings and see half of the commissioners don't show up. We see there are not enough monitors for the projects that are being done. We see major construction going on, and yet our people are not on these jobs. In the year 2018, it is sad that the construction industry is still predominantly an all-white male industry and is controlled mostly by the unions. We feel like the unions should be accountable to the City of Boston as they bring in mostly all-white males. Some of the unions are changing the way they operate and are bringing in people of color, women, and Boston residents. But some are still stuck in the 18 and 1900s. I am here today to ask you to adopt the Economic Justice Commission so we may be able to break this continuing cycle of Black and brown residents being left out. Boston should be embarrassed to be the most gentrifying city in the country. Boston should be embarrassed to be named the most racist city in the country. Boston should be embarrassed to know as a city, white people's assets are $247,000, while Black people's assets are $8. There is something seriously wrong with that picture, and changes need to be made. And you as city councilors can help make that change. And I'm done with my testimony, but I just wanted to say something because City Council Ayanna Presley brought it up about compensating for the work that the monitors are doing. A couple years ago, I had put in some type of metrics, how if you had community monitoring throughout the city by district, how you can stipend people. We're not asking you to pay us like you pay the monitors, but it's our time, it's our gas that we use to go to these meetings, and it's our mind that we're bringing and helping the city. So I would just like for you all to think about that. There's some kind of way that the monitors can be compensated as far as a stipend. I'm not asking for a salary, we're just asking for a stipend. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ms. Summer. Thank you, Beji. Councilor Turner?
Yeah. My name is Chuck Turner. I'm coordinator of the Boston Jobs Coalition. I want to begin by thanking you for calling this hearing that is part of the revised Boston residency job policy. I think these twice yearly hearings on the policy and the BEC operation are critically important, not just in terms of seeing whether the details of the ordinance are being worked out, but also looking at the policy issues, because the Boston residency job policy should not be seen as a stone, element that is solid and to be implemented, but it should be seen as a living framework for bringing equity to the city of Boston. And so these hearings, with the council playing its role as a monitor both of the carrying out of the ordinance as well as thinking about other policy issues, is critically important. What I'd like to do is just briefly look at some of the issues of policy change that would be important for the council to look at, discuss, and think about how to move forward. However, before that, I thought it might be helpful just to give a little context of where the Boston residency job policy came from. In May 5th, 1975, 2,000 white workers marched on Boston City Hall and demanded the defunding of the what was called the Third World Jobs Clearinghouse. They demanded the defunding because they said that the work of the clearinghouse was interfering with the ability of white workers to get jobs in the city, which was a complete fallacy because the unions were a suburban-based group, as they are now, and white workers in Boston were having problems similar to what we were having as workers of color. The thought was that if we don't find a way of linking the problems of the white workers in the city with the problems that we are having as workers of color, that the unions will always be able to play us off against each other, and politically we won't be able to move forward. And because of that recognition, we said what we need to do is to link residency with the idea of affirmative action for workers of color and women. And to us, that's still important as a framework of thought. That is to see it not just as an affirmative action program for people of color, but to see it as a program designed to bring equity for all workers in Boston, recognizing the problems that workers of color have had, that women have had, but also recognizing that to be a white construction worker in Boston is not the same thing as it was 30 and 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when the base of the unions were here in Boston. Now it's in the suburbs, and so that means that the workers, white workers of the suburbs, are in a better position. Given that history, let me just say that from '76, when the community came up with the concept of the residency program, to 1980, when Mayor Flynn adopted it as a policy, as executive order policy during a very tough election, to the Supreme Court discussion where the Supreme Court said, yes, this is a policy that's constitutional, to the development, passage of a BRJP ordinance in 1983 with some counselors who had said they would never support affirmative action, but when it was linked to residency, said, of course, and moved forward with it, improving it, primarily because it made the link. I think if it had just been a question of workers of color, it would never have passed. I think that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. In terms of the areas that I think need to be looked at, they've all been touched in one way or another by the discussion that's going on. As Priscilla said, the Commission on Economic Justice, which the BJC is presenting, and we appreciate that it's being, it was filed, that there's going to be a hearing on it. And we think it's important that people acknowledge that there's a major problem in terms of compliance, because if we don't have people of color, Boston workers and women who are in the unions and in the large nonprofits, then the reality is compliance isn't going to happen. That is, we can have improvement, but if we're talking about a compliance that says that these percentages of hours is a city-wide project to be implemented in every part of this city, if we want that, we have to have workers from Boston, workers of color and women, sufficient to meet those the needs that are there. And in order to do that, we have to, in fact, work with the unions to make their diversity match the diversity of the policy. And the same with the non-union contractors. The larger non-union contractors need to work with them to have them open their ranks for Boston workers, workers of color, and women. And we believe that the Commission on Economic Justice is a vehicle to do that. A second issue was touched on, and that is that the city of Boston should provide the leadership role in terms of the implementing of this policy. You know, if private contractors look at the actions that are taking place on City of Boston projects and don't see it being enforced in the way that would say that the city is truly committed to it, then they're going to believe that they could pull back. In order to have that relationship between the Public Facilities Commission and the departments who are financing the work that's going on in terms of construction in the parks, in schools, other fire stations, police department, other aspects of our public work, in order to have that work move forward in a very focused way, the departments, as the representatives mentioned, there has to be a close working relationship between the departments and public facilities and the staff that has the responsibility of monitoring. For that reason, I think you ought to consider for your April 2019 hearing, you ought to consider inviting representative of the Public Facilities Department to come and discuss the coordination of the work of the departments with the Monitoring Committee. For the department to come and look at the compliance numbers. What are the numbers, compliance numbers for the various city departments that are letting contracts under the aegis of the Public Facilities Commission? And by having that as part of the discussion, we can have a clearer picture of whether the city is really not just talking about the monitoring staff, but the city that's letting those contracts are really playing their role in terms of the enforcement. On private projects, we want the developers there because the developers are playing a key role with compliance, not just the contractors. Well, on city projects, we ought to have the developers of those projects playing a equally strong and persevering role. So in the next hearing, I hope we could see representatives of the city here talking about their compliance. If we look at the ordinance, we see that there's language. When you look at the sanctions aspects of the ordinance, there's language that says that there will be the requirement that both for city projects and private projects, there'll be a record of compliance that can be used to determine future contracts. It's very encouraging language, but I think the question that we all need to be raising is, how does that get implemented? How do we begin to identify those companies that have historical track record of non-compliance and have a process where it can be more and more difficult for them to get contracts? The language is very inspiring, but if there's no process, then it's just rhetoric. One thing that could happen immediately is that the council could ask the mayor to issue an order to the departments that whenever a contract is being issued, that you request through the Salesforce data process that you request a 5-year compliance history for that particular organization that's applying. That's not the total answer, but if contractors begin to understand that their past history of compliance is a factor in terms of getting contracts, if contractors can see that the contractors that are getting the contracts have a history of better compliance than then that will begin to improve the situation. My time up?
No, I would never, please. No, I just, point of information, I was curious if the coalition is supporting Senator Chang Diaz's legislation, Bill 1684, which is state legislation that ostensibly offers what you're proposing, if you're aware of it, basically a grading system, a look back. If you've already been proven that you're a bad actor, then you shouldn't even be considered.
Yes, definitely. We haven't looked at it in detail, but that concept is a concept that we support and that we think the city of Boston could implement it in January. What stops the departments from assessing the history? We have the Salesforce data system that is an amazingly effective system of pulling that data together, of putting before you, so the excuse of, well, it's too much work, we don't think is any longer done. And we think that coming out of this hearing, there ought to be at least one priority, and that is that every department does a 5-year check on the history of compliance so that we can begin to, at the very least, know the nature of those who are being hired. Another area is the area of Boston workers of color. You heard the numbers that Mr. Barrows stated. 51 for public projects, 51% workers of color, 21% Boston residents, and 6% women. What those numbers say to us, if we really think about it, is that if the workers of color are at 51%, but the city of Boston is at 21%, what that means is those of us in Boston who are construction workers are again being left out. That is, if you have more workers of color than you do Boston workers in general, then obviously that means that the workers of color are coming from the suburbs. If they were coming from the city, then the numbers of city compliance would be up in the 40, 50%. We asked Ms. Crockett to put a feature into this ordinance that would specify a percentage for Boston workers. It wasn't done for various technical reasons, and we're suggesting to the council that as you think about amendments to make in the ordinance, it's essential. I think if we're concerned about workers of color in Boston getting a fair share, then they have to be identified as a specific group that has a right to a percentage that's calculated along with people of color in general. But we can't afford to ignore Boston workers just because the numbers, 51% looks high. If the 51% is an indication that the workers of Boston, workers of color of Boston, aren't getting our share, then that's the 51% is a problem, not a glorious victory. The other issue I'd raise, there are a lot of issues, but it was touched on, the relationship between Madison Park Vocational High and the unions. There is only one union, to my understanding, that gives credit to applicants in the painting industry who graduated from the Boston, from Madison Park. Carpenters don't have that. Electricians, they're doing great work, but it's not there. And there needs to be the building or rebuilding of that relationship between the unions and what's going on at Madison Park. I think that would do a tremendous amount to breathe positive expectations into the students who are going through the classes, if they can see that this is a stepping stone to get into the unions. Right now, it's not that, except the painters. And if the city of Boston could use its power of influence to say to the unions, you have a responsibility, in fact, to have the education that goes on at Madison be a first step into your union application, then I think it's another way of coming at the issue of how do we get more Boston workers of color into the unions and into the larger non-union contractors. So thank you very much, and just keep up the good work.
Thank you, Counselor. Okay. And so, does Dick still want to testify? Yeah. Dick Monks? And then next we'll hear from Don Carlson.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dick Monks. I'm a member of City Life Vita Urbana and the designated representative on the Boston Jobs Coalition, as well as a monitor on the JP Rocks multiple projects that are turning Washington Street into a canyon. I say all that because, and I know this council is very concerned about disparity and about economic justice, and racial justice, and I find that I'm emphasizing City Life, as you know, is a housing justice primarily organization, but it understands a big part of our displacement policy is good jobs. And so we're involved as City Life in trying to support and work with those efforts. So understanding the breadth of what you're taking on is really important. When the new ordinance was written, it was very specifically and thought out to say that we want these hearings twice a year. And I think today showed why that's so important. And I was very encouraged and impressed, but not surprised, that you all were pushing the envelope in the very first meeting and bringing up questions and perspectives and ideas around how and what are the shortcomings when we talked about the wages. You know, we're not monitoring the wages. That's not part of the ordinance. You talked about the wage theft possibilities. You talked about the lack of child care for women. You talked about the checkerboard effect of shuffling people around to meet the numbers. These are all really important issues, and it's encouraging to me that at the very first meeting, you all have noticed that and have addressed that. And I'm just, follow Chuck, there's really not much more to say, and I wouldn't try to improve on what he said. I am speaking specifically about the Economic Justice Commission that you're aware is before you, and I think today showed why that's important. And you all were trying to get behind the numbers. You know, too often the history of and this is not at all a criticism of the current leadership of the BRJP, but has been just a recitation of the law, what the numbers are, and thank you, goodbye. And I think you're pushing for the facts and the figures and the reasons behind the numbers is what exactly why we need and want this body to take responsibility on implementing the much-needed Boston residency jobs policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick, and I was remiss to acknowledge that we've been joined by an ally in this work and our good friend and colleague, Ed Flynn. Thank you for joining us, Counselor. Did you want to offer anything before we move on to the next public testimony?
Sure, I'll be brief, Counselor. Thank you. And I just want to say I support the great work that all of you are doing here. This is an issue that it needs to be reviewed and looked at periodically to make sure that the current laws on the books are enforced, and to learn from, you know, the previous year and to make improvements to ensure that the Boston Jobs for Boston Residents policy is not only enforced, but it's also expanded to be more inclusive. And that's something I'm looking forward to working with you on and with the people in the audience. And I do apologize for being very late this afternoon, but I do look forward to reviewing the tapes as well. But I just want to say thank you to all of you for your strong leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Counselor. All right, and now we'll hear from Don.
My name is Don Carlson. I'm testifying as a concerned resident, not representing any organization. I've spent more than 40 years consulting with a wide range of domestic and international organizations in a number of areas. Most of my work centered on strengthening their workforce and their organizational culture. I was a partner in Booz Allen and Hamilton, and spent several years working in McKinsey & Company. For the last few years, I've been working with 3 nonprofit organizations in Boston on job-related issues in communities of color. I authored the economic development section of the NAACP's report card on the Walsh administration that we published last October. So I'm not here speaking on behalf of any of these organizations, but rather as a concerned resident of Boston with some expertise in the matter at hand. My fundamental concern is to help reverse the bleak economic situation of communities of color in Boston. So I'm delighted to see the City Council conducting a hearing to review the BEC and the BRJP, which are important elements of economic development for communities of color, and can be more so. And we've heard a number of ideas on how it can be more so. Jobs in the building trades are good jobs, in terms of pay, benefits, and hours. Meeting the BRJP standards is a positive all the way around. There is no downside. Meeting the standards has obvious value for Boston residents, but also for the city. Higher earned incomes save the city money and increase the tax base. The BRJP holds much promise, but the results have been lacking through 2017. I tried to get year-to-date 2018 results with no success. We heard a little bit about it today, but I'm not sure I quite understood what the data was. Hopefully, there's been an uptick in 2018, but based on the data we have, there's been a constant shortfall. I've met members of the BEC and the BRJP team. I'm sure they are quite dedicated to their work, but the results are flat, even with the new higher standards introduced in January of last year. Something different needs to be done, needs to be added to this effort. More creative thinking is needed to break out of the pattern of consistently weak results. We need to better understand the roadblocks to achieving the standards of the BRJP and figure out how they can be overcome. If a roadblock for employers is finding willing workers in Boston, then let's find ways to help them identify Boston residents who want to work in the building trades. If a roadblock is lack of skills in willing workers, let's find ways to build those skills. The city funds a few programs in the building trades, but they're tiny. They don't meet the need and the opportunity. If nothing else, we should recognize the economic value to the city, just to the city, of preparing a person for a well-paying job in the building trades who is now unemployed or underemployed or heading for a dead-end job. If a roadblock is entry to union apprenticeship programs, let's understand why and figure out what can be done. If some unions welcome diversity, what is unique about their leadership, their membership, their goals, and their culture? How can we encourage and spread that viewpoint? If some unions resist diversity, why is that? How might they be converted? The Commission for Economic Justice, proposed by the Boston Jobs Coalition, that I understand the council will consider next month, can help in that respect. There are probably several other roadblocks. So I wish I could come here with a list of solutions, but you all know that's not the way it works when you have a long-standing and complex challenge that has not been met. When a big corporation or government entity would ask my old firm to solve a problem they couldn't solve themselves, you know there's no easy answer. You have to figure it out, typically by doing research and analysis and getting the right people together to develop and test and hone ideas. We need the city to assume leadership on this issue. No other entity has the combination of power, moral suasion, resources, and I hope the motivation needed to crack this nut. We're talking about residents of the city of Boston who need help. What can the city do? Unless officials have been holding back on magic solutions, the city can launch an effort to create solutions. I suggest the starting point would be to form a working group of people, both from inside the administration and outside, people who have familiarity with the issue and a dedication to finding solutions. Have them conduct the research and analysis to understand the roadblocks and provide the basis for developing ideas. The lack of data is a constant frustration to those of us involved in this issue. Then get them thinking about how to achieve the standards in the BRJP. Figure out what the city by itself can do, but also what the city can do through unions, employers, schools, nonprofits, and others in the community. Then turn those ideas into action to get us out of this rut that we've been in for so many years and help the Boston residents who want to find good jobs in the building trades. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your participation and your engagement on this issue in community and within the halls. Oh, I'm sorry. Those names weren't checked, though. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. There wasn't a check here. Okay, Janet, did you want to testify? Look here, left. Oh, okay. I apologize. And Brother Lowe? Okay. Well, two of our favorite people will have the final word. I do have
This is it. Janet Jones, Dorchester Roxbury Labor Committee, Boston Jobs Coalition. I think that many of the testifiers are new counselors who have asked all the really key questions here, but I could just add a few notes from the field. We got started, I just think a little history is always important from different parts of the city. So the Dorchester-Roxbury Committee came into its own when Charlotte Ritchie set up issue committees in Dorchester. And as a part of her advisory committee, we filled a hall early on in Upham's Corner to encourage male and female workers of color to apply to work on the Boston Convention Center, which was the big project of the time. I was not present. I was busy at the sign-in table when Joe Nigro announced to an enormous room full of workers, male and female, almost all of color. "Well," he said, "here you are. Where have you all been?" It was one of the more insulting remarks that has ever been made in that hall. Improvement has been made since then, and many hardworking staff and persistent activists have been involved in diversifying the building trades. Yet the statistics that many of us are all too familiar with do not meet even the prior diversity standards, let alone those required by law under the new BRJP ordinance. We heard a lot about that today, and a lot of questions were very well directed to that particularly sad situation. So those of us that are here today and attend regular oversight meetings, both in our communities and right in this building, request that this review process, which is beginning now, be thorough and finally produce the desired results in union membership with access to training and the good paying jobs with benefits that are rightly those of the workers. I want to say, just as a side note, that I have been working in my own community of the Bowdoin, Geneva part of Dorchester on projects that fall below the requirements of the plan. So I have been instituting some safety regulations, asking about workforce, and trying to pressure them in whatever way I can to hire folks of color. There are very few female workers of color who want to have the new non-union jobs, and that's another issue I think we could address. Safety on those jobs for women and better pay for all the workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Brother Lowe?
Yes. I want to first thank you, city councilors, for taking the time to be here and calling this hearing. And I also want to thank my colleagues for the hard work and the diligence they have been fighting to do this. And also Chris Brown and his group. We've been fighting with Chris for a long time, and he's been there and he's been diligent about trying to, be on the same page as we are about making things happen. And I also just want to say that, Mr. Flynn, I appreciate you being here also, because our problem, one of our problems, the construction industry, as you know, is dominated by white males. And if the other city councilors could have been here, it would have made me feel like they were more interested in this very important issue, And this is, to me, is a very important issue. And I'd like to also speak about the people that we're talking about employing. I mean, they oftentimes say they can't find people. Well, in our efforts to do recruiting, we find it quite difficult sometimes to recruit people, males and females from our communities, because they feel like getting in the construction industry is not a path for them. They don't really believe that it's the union is going to open up the doors. And as you know, the unions have been a problem, and we hope that the unions would find it a way to try to open up the doors and allow more employment and training in our community. And one of the things we have to talk about is seriously about training. You can't open the doors for people who are not trained. I mean, if I'm a contractor and I got a person that's not skilled, I'm somewhat reluctant to bring them on just to meet the numbers. But if we increase the training, in our community, people of color, black and brown people, we can open up the doors and provide. And there's a lot of people in our community who have skills, you know, non-union people. And if we can somehow work that out where non-union is allowed to get a lot more work in our community, then I think it will be beneficial to people in our community. And I just want to thank you again for this opportunity, and I want to say have a good day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Oh. Counselor, you had one more thing? I'm so sorry, I have a hard stop at 3, so I have to leave, but I will turn the end of this chairmanship over. So we'll have a final testimony and then closing statements by the lead sponsors.
This is not testimony. When I went back to sit down, I realized that I had forgotten the most important thing that I wanted to say, and that is I wanted to thank Ms. Crockett. And because I think we really need to recognize the work that she did with John and Chris has really been phenomenal. If you look at the ordinance and then look at the regulations that have been put in place to have the ordinance be a living document that has sanctions that are realistic, it came out of the creativity of that team and the staff that they had there. And so I think we really have to say how much we appreciate the work they've done. And now it's up to us to make sure that we make sure that that work that they've done to improve the situation for those of us in the city can keep going forward because of the push that the council and others are doing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Counselor. We didn't forget, we were getting you in our closing statements, Carolyn. But we so appreciate the counselor amplifying your role and your partnership and your patience and your creativity throughout this process. That will certainly be a part of your legacy. And so now I'll just turn it over to closing statements from the lead sponsors of this hearing order.
Very briefly, thank you all for coming here. Thank you to the administration for your testimony and also staying throughout to listen to folks. I really appreciate that. I look forward to April's update hearing and making sure that we set a standard today. We had some questions, and again, I think it's to acknowledge it's the first time we're doing this, and that it will only increase and get better. Thank you for the recommendations for questions and things that we should look forward to in April. I think we are forming a wonderful coalition that's going to continue a vital conversation. Thank you very much.
Councilor Janey?
Oh, thank you so much, Madam Vice Chair, and certainly want to again say thank you to Councilor Edwards for her partnership on this important issue. Certainly want to acknowledge your amazing work, Carolyn Crockett, and all of the folks from the administration who were here. And last but not least, the individuals who are here and not present in the chamber who I get to partner with on this important issue every other week as we monitor construction jobs in Roxbury. This is an important issue all across our city. It's not just about Roxbury jobs, but making sure that we are closing the income gap, the wealth gap, making sure that people in Boston, people of color and women have every opportunity to these good jobs. These are good jobs, and we need to make sure that there's equity. So I'm really grateful to the individuals who are here that I get to partner with. Thank you for your advocacy, for your commitment, and just keep pushing forward. We've got a lot more work to do. And thank you.
And I also just wanted to, for those that were tuning in the second half, thank Councilor Baker for his participation in convening the first part of this hearing as chair of this committee.
And Councilor Flynn, thank you.
And Councilor Flynn. All right, and with that, we'll adjourn. The work continues.